Good morning, team. I just wanted to give you a quick update on what's happening at the board meetings, just because I thought it's a good thing to convey to you guys the synopsis of what happened at them. So with that, I'm just going to kind of go through the agenda and what we hit. So the first thing we do is we approve the reports. First one is the secretary minutes, and basically that is the minutes of the previous, so it would be the January meeting. I didn't do a update video for you guys for January, and I won't go through the January meeting, but I'll just let you know one of the main things that would be on there. Eric was nominated as or voted in as the chairman of the board to represent the board at the different meetings. We recognize some new positions, Heather Hartong and Kelly Stoach being on the church board. And we recognize Jason Hartong as being the assistant financial secretary. And then we did approve the transfer of the membership of Tyler and Samantha Newmeyer from Sturgis Missionary to Trinity Missionary Church, which is Tyler's dad's church. So that's basically the gist of what happened in that meeting and what we approved with the secretary's minutes. From there, we went to the treasurer's report. And basically, to summarize this, if you want to see the details in it, feel free to go to our folder that has all the board reports into it. It's over kind of by the mailbox area, usually either on top of the mailbox stand or where there's that coat rack, right where those two double doors open up. Sometimes that folder is setting up there. So if you want to see the details of where money was spent and stuff like that, that's where to go. But just a highlight for that is we brought in $4,000 more than what we spent in January, right? Our February meeting is looking at January. So $4,000 in the positive, that's a great thing. Currently, our checking account stands at $118,000. We do have money in there from our reimbursement from our insurance claim. About 40,000 of that is from that insurance claim for the roof. And then in our reserve account, in our savings account, we have a little over $320,000, which gives us a grand total of almost $439,000 in financial assets in our accounts. So that would be the treasurer's report. The deacons, they basically met this month, and basically what they did, and I was a part of it as well, we went through our membership roll, seeing who we haven't seen in a year, and talked about what letter to send them, asking if they still want to have membership, or putting a deadline onto it to say, hey, if we don't hear from you at this point, we'll assume that you want your membership dropped. So we have a letter we send to those who have moved, and we have a letter that's sent to those who we haven't seen. And then we have another letter of people that we know are going through a really hard time and are struggling, potentially emotionally and maybe with some hurt, that we did not put in there your membership will be revoked. It was just more of a reaching out to them saying, hey, we miss you, we'd love to see you, is there anything that we can do for you? So we kind of divided that up into those three sections of the people that we haven't seen. So we're finalizing those letters, making sure that everybody's in agreement with those, and then once they're finalized, we will be sending them out. Trustees report, I talked about our sign out front. The lights aren't working onto it, so they looked into it, found that the ballast is bad into it. The ballast is super expensive, so they're toying with the idea of putting in a new system of lights in there that'll draw a whole lot less power because of how much power those lights pull. And Craig was joking around that poor Patrick and Craig, they were looking into it and working onto it. And I guess there is a bazillion screws to take out to be able to get to that. So thank you, those guys, for doing that work. And they're not going to fix the thing till it gets a little bit warmer, because it is a huge panel that has to come off. And if there's any kind of wind, they don't want to damage it even more. And obviously, with it being cold and windy and having a bazillion little screws they got to work on, just isn't productive. So they'll be working on that in the future, and that's what's going on, what they're looking at. And then pastor's report. This one's the longer one of all of them. So statistic wise, we're down. We look at statistics on a 10-week average, just because it's a little bit better because of numbers jumping around. If you have special holidays, it can really skew the numbers. So 10-week average, we're down 3 from what we were last month at a 10-week average. So we're averaging 63 adults on Sunday morning attendance. But our YouTube views were up by 5. We're averaging 18 for the first week's message in just that first week time frame. So we just look at Sunday through Saturday. How many views do we get in that amount of time? And that's just the number that we go by. So there's on an average 18 people that in that week's message tune in. And then we look at the same thing with our website in that Saturday or that Sunday to Saturday. Just in that time frame, we don't look at how many people connected with it later on, how many people connected with our church through that, and we're averaging 48, and that's +2 from what it was with the 10-week average last month. Then highlights, we did the foam bullet battle with kids, and the adults were involved with it as well. The women held a breakfast for the men, which went really well. We had 2 people from the community join us, and one of those individuals made it that next Sunday to church too, and they had attended the church one other time before that. We got the ministry reports out to the congregation to look over. We've been fine-tuning our communication, making sure that we have that one spot to get all the information, but also have that avenue for the people who don't have internet access and might be afraid to use the kiosk. So we're trying to put a little bit more in our pre-service slides that way, and just trying to do highlights with our bulletin and with our onstage announcements. Our finance committee is meeting to look over some stuff. We have some things to be updating. And then I just highlighted Anna's end of year communication report. I was speaking about how we've had 2,400 unique user visits to our website. I think that's phenomenal. And over last year, we've had 16 new people subscribe to our YouTube page, which I thought was phenomenal. Sad news is sadly, the Happels decided to leave the church, and that will take Meredith and Lauren Bowes as well. Sarah Bowes isn't doing well enough where she can attend church anymore. And that's kind of what it sounds like from what I've heard through third-hand knowledge. That's what was kind of keeping Sally here, was for the stability for Sarah. And once she wasn't able to make it, they just don't feel like there's anything here for them anymore. So they are moving on. And then we looked at the vision because we've had a few people leave because they disagree with the vision of Sturgis Missionary Church. And so the last board meeting, we looked at the idea of they probably don't mean the vision like what we're thinking of the vision statement. They just are in a disagreement with what the church is doing. But because what the church is doing is based off of the vision, I still think there is a correlation there. So there was some not misunderstanding of what our vision is, but there was people saying, oh, we don't really know the vision and it's really shouldn't be all that important. And I kind of get it, but kind of not. So we kind of, or in my report, I went over the vision of the church. We've went over it many times, but I added new details because I found that people in some cases have misunderstood what we mean in the vision statement when we try to simplify it. So I put in, what does this piece mean and what does it not? So, right, our vision statement is a devoted community of believers rooted, built up, and walking in Christ in their worship of God, making disciples and spreading the gospel so all acquaintances have heard and no believers left without a church home. And I expressed to them that it's not just something that we have down on a piece of paper, but we honestly look at each event that we're doing and say, does this line up to our vision? If this is what God has called us to do as a church, we've double checked that this is scriptural, and we don't feel like there's anything that we're missing in scripture that says this is how it's going to look when we do ministry. We really use this as a catalyst as each thing comes forward. So with that, took the highlights then of those main points of what a church is called to do. Devoted community. So the purpose of a devoted community is to create strong bonds so attendees are authentically there for one another, physically and emotionally. And then I have passages that support all these do's and don'ts. You can see the provided sheet if you want to see those. What it does not mean, a devoted community is not a manufactured community to connect people. For if it's just about connecting people, there will always be an easier and more natural, appealing choice of these other communities. So if we're just trying to connect people and make friend groups, well, they can find that at the local golf course, or they can find that at the local Dungeons and Dragons convention, whatever it is. There's these other avenues that are a lot of times easier and more natural for them to connect into if it's just about building friendships. And for that matter, you can have that at another church, right? Well, I can be with a group of loving believers if I'm at this other church too. And we've seen that where people just drop to other churches because their friends are there, or the people that they were friends with at this church moved to another church. So they just went with them because they want that manufactured community of just friendship. And so that's where we're saying, no, when we say devoted community, we're talking about these strong bonds to the point where we're taking care of one another. Not just we hang out, we have fun, we laugh and we joke, but no, I am there for you in a time that you have a need, whether it's a physical need or an emotional need. So I'm crying with you if you're crying, I'm rejoicing with you if you're rejoicing. And these are things that are harder to get in these other more surfacey friendship things. And so when we are striving for a devoted community, we're striving for that being there for one another. That's what the church talks about, or the Bible talks about when it talks about fellowship. It's not just carrying on a conversation. It's not just about friendships. It's about something that goes much deeper than that. Then we looked at rooted. What does it mean to be rooted? Well, the purpose is to inform through deep and thoughtful consideration to produce a rational steadfastness in the faith. Right? What does it not mean? Well, being rooted doesn't mean that our faith is so strong that we never ask any questions, or we never have the ability to question our faith and ask people about the truthfulness of what we believe. That's not what we mean about being rooted. Oh, you need to be rooted. You shouldn't ever question the truthfulness of what you believe. It's really about the exact opposite. It's about the ability to ask those questions, because that's what's going to help you develop that assurance of what you believe. And so what we're saying is we're going to help people be rooted by, we're going to give those deep, thoughtful considerations to people's questions, and we're going to give them rational responses that can help make them steadfast. So additionally, though, on top of that, because answering the questions is so important, faith is not going to be something that we are going to support by arbitrary perspectives, meaning it's just my mere opinion. So I'm just going to tell you my opinion on what something is. And it's not going to be something that's based off of something that hasn't been researched, right? Kind of stays in the same aspect of being arbitrary. And we're not going to use oversimplified statements. And what we mean by oversimplified statement, right, is when you simplify something so much, it's no longer true. It might sound exhilarating and exciting, but the problem with anything that's arbitrary or oversimplified is when life happens, usually those things fall short. What you've sown is roots that are very shallow, and when the hardships of life hit, then the roots wither and die because they were not established enough. Whether it's when you're trying to give a reason for the hope that is in you, and it's based off a very oversimplified statement, or the trials of life come. So we're making sure we're hitting really strong roots by making sure we're doing the hard work. Built up. What do we mean by being built up? It means biblical principles are applied to one's life, so there's continued growth in spiritual knowledge and godly character. All right, we got to remember that being built up is twofold, because there's a problem with one of those. Most people don't mind being grown in godly character, but they don't really like the spiritual knowledge part. And then there's other people that they love the spiritual knowledge part, but they don't want the church telling them how they should live their life. We have to understand that being built up is both cases. So what is building up not about? Being built up is not solely a process of becoming a better you. For without the advancement in the knowledge of doctrine and the nature of God, one cannot expect to be equipped for the work of ministry or to know the one whom they profess to love. Right? If you profess that you love God, you've given your life to him, then you're gonna need to be willing to learn more about who he is. If you love him, you want to know about him. Right? If you want to do the work of ministry, if you're called to do the work of ministry, then you're going to have to understand the doctrines, because you have to explain them to people in a way that they can understand them. Right? So you won't always give the bigger explanation of doctrine, but you have to know the bigger explanation of doctrine in order for you to articulate something to the greatest extent. So that's what we mean about being built up. Walking, what do we mean to walk with God? It's to promote and live kingdom principles with authenticity and fidelity, to be part of what God is doing on this earth through his empowerment, and to illuminate God's character through our actions. Right? What are we not meaning when we say walking with God? Walking with God is not an experience that's based on emotionalism or the product of fear or guilt. Now, this one brought up a little bit of discussion at our meeting. And here's the clincher with emotionalism. It's not that we're against emotionalism and we'll never have an emotional part of services. Those can be very beneficial, to be excited, to be raising hands. We're not saying we're against that. What we're saying is just to be there only is not good enough, because the problem with just emotionalism is it lacks discipleship and the development of the mind. If all we do is get people on an emotional high, but never speak to them why they can keep that even when times get tough, we didn't disciple them. All we did is help them in a moment that they were already feeling good. We got to transfer that over and say, how do you stay on track even when life gets tough? Not when you're here worshiping God and everything seems to be going good. Right? So emotionalism lacks that discipleship and that development of mind, saying, okay, now we got to think through these really exciting details. And then we don't want to go to the point where we're motivating people off of fear of you're going to go to hell, right? We talk about hell, that's important, but we don't want them just being saved just because they want to escape hell, but they really are lacking the love for God. They're not being motivated because they love God. They're motivated because they're afraid of him, right? We're told in the Bible to fear God. There is a piece of that, but that shouldn't be the overwhelming motivation of somebody. And the same goes for guilt. If people just feel guilty, they're being motivated off their guilt. Again, not for their love for who God is. And we want people motivated for their love for who God is, not because of negative aspects. So again, I'm not saying we're not going to preach about sin. I'm not saying that we're not going to talk about hell. What I'm saying is those are part of the puzzle, but those should not be the overwhelming force that people are following God for. We want them to be following God because he's love. It needs to be a part of the equation. All right, so worship of God. What does it mean to worship God? It's to spread the praise, glory, and honor of God. If that is the case, then what is it not? The worship of God is not dependent on the worshiper having a physical or emotional experience. Again, we're not saying we don't want them to have a physical or emotional experience. What we're saying is that's not the criteria to know that somebody is having the opportunity to worship God, right? Godly worship is not found in a particular method. Right? There's not just one way to do it. There's not just one type of music to do this with. We understand that worship of God is manifold. Though these expressions are not always wrong in and of themselves, the problem is the focus can become self-pleasure rather than worship of God. Right? The church doesn't sing the right songs because I don't get into those songs. I can't worship God with that song. The problem with that statement is, yes, you can, as long as the lyrics are spreading the praise, glory, and honor of who God is. Just because you don't like the beat of the music doesn't prevent you from worshiping. What you're looking at is self-pleasure. I don't like the tune of that music, therefore I don't want to worship God through that tune of music. See the problem? So what we're saying is, if people are coming up to us and are having a problem with the music that we're singing, it has nothing to do with the lyrics, but it's all about the beat or their preference of the thing, we don't have to feel like we are messing up on our vision, because it's not about them having a physical or emotional experience. Are we providing avenues for them to praise, glorify, and honor God? Right. So that's what we're looking at in those things. It's sometimes we hold barriers up on it's more about my self-pleasure than really is about worshiping God. So we do want to do it in a way that they have those physical and emotional experiences, but that's not the end goal, or I should say the end goal. That's not what determines whether it's worship or not, because everybody's going to be at a different level. We can't hit everybody at the same time, right? So lastly, then, what do we mean by spreading the gospel? When we're talking to all of our acquaintances to spread the gospel, when we're making sure those who are believers have a church home, what are we looking at there? The purpose is to have compassion for those who are missing out on a relationship with God, so that the Christian shares the message of salvation with gentleness and respect. What is it not? Spreading the gospel is not about getting people saved. But that is a burden that we are not called to carry, right? Spreading the gospel is just about spreading the good news, having the conversation. It is not about whether the person accepts the message or not, right? We do our best to try to make sure that we communicate it to the best of our ability. We might grow in that as we journey on this walk, but it's not a responsibility to get people saved. It's just about being faithful to God, to be his witness. So that was my report, just to kind of help people understand what our vision is, what does it mean, and what does it not mean? Where do people take it in the wrong direction and say, you're not doing, and though nobody's communicated this to us, but would look at it and say, well, you're not making a devoted community because I don't have this. Well, we're not talking about making friend groups, right? We're talking about that strong commitment. So things like that. So that was that. Then after the reports, then we got into the discussion items. We talked about parachurch organizations and missionaries the church doesn't have in their budget to support, how our volunteers are becoming overwhelmed with having to be the third party in receiving people's funds for those organizations, and then having to write checks to those organizations, or to keep track of how much has been donated, and then periodically write checks to those organizations. That there seems to have been a purpose in the past for that, for tax exempt purposes, but most of these organizations can get tax exempt stuff on their own. The church was probably had more volunteers at one point where it was easier to be able to do this for the congregation. It's just overwhelming and hard to manage on our end, and we're not for sure that we can do this well. So what we're going to do is those that we know that are doing that currently, we'll have a conversation with them, just let them know, hey, we're not going to be able to do this anymore. And then we're going to announce to the entire congregation, just say, hey, if you want to designate funds to something that is in our budget, that is fine, to a building fund or to the youth, something like that. But we can no longer do it for the parachurch organizations or to missionaries well, really even missionaries that we support, just because things are set at a certain standard and it can get confusing to try to change stuff up. So kind of asking people to, or telling people we won't be able to do that anymore. And then we have the Bethel University Scholarship Fund, where people can designate funds that they give to the church to go to that scholarship. And then anybody who's attending Bethel College can ask be a recipient of that scholarship. And then Bethel College will match the funds, whatever the church sends with that individual. So the deacons meet and they divvy up the funds according to how many people ask for the scholarship. So as a church, we only put $100 into it. So it's funded mainly through what the congregation puts in. What we found is that there's some people who have chosen not to use Bethel University, but another Christian college. So the board talked about it and said, okay, let's set up a second scholarship. We don't want to get rid of the Bethel one because of our heritage with Bethel. But we do think it's important to be investing into students' lives. So again, this isn't a church-funded line item budget. It's for people if they want to help the students out. It's just an extra thing we can do as a blessing to people in our congregation to be able to do this. So we're gonna create the Christian College Scholarship that can be used by individuals as well. So that way, when these other Christian colleges will do the matching funds coming from a church, can be a blessing for those who utilize it. So we'll be creating that, we decided. And then we looked at the native planting that we want to do around the church. And so with that information, we looked at the basics of what are we looking at when we're talking about doing this. So basically, we're taking a lot of our yard and we're turning it into native plantings. We were looking originally, the proposal was 7 acres of wildflowers and native grasses, and that would leave us with 2 acres of lawn, basically in the front of our church, some of the front of the church, and a little bit in the back of a church. So basically everywhere that we've used in the last few years to do church picnics or to play volleyball or something like that, to have enough flat open space that we can still use those areas in our yard lawn, but not have this overwhelming thing. We're spending, I think it's close to $6 grand a year, $5 grand a year to mow. So it just doesn't seem to be making much sense. And why spend that much money when you could be surrounded by beautiful wildflowers? So we're looking at a cost of around $2,000 to put in the wildflowers and to be able to just shoot some trails in there to have walking trails. And we talked about having other phases to this to make it more exciting and fun, but we just for now want to get the wildflowers established and walking trails through it, very simple walking trails. So I have a sheet that kind of says about what the wildflowers would look like. Share my screen so you can see the basics of what I'm looking at here as well. So flowers in May, we're going to have 2 different types of flowers that are blooming. You'd have a yellow and blue going on. In June, you're going to have 8 different varieties of flowers blooming. I have the colors listed there. July, we're starting to hit the peak time. You have 14 different varieties of flowers blooming and the multiple colors there. August, you have 13 varieties of flowers blooming. September, you'd have 7 varieties of flowers blooming. In October, you'd have 2 varieties of flowers blooming and have those colors throughout that spring to early fall time frame throughout the year. And then grasses, there'd be 4 varieties of the natural grasses, and what we'd be making sure we have is we don't have the tall grasses in the front areas of our building. We might allow some of those to be in the back part just to add some contrast in height. And then we didn't talk too much about the maintenance there, but basically you're looking at a 5-year burn, and the local chapter of Pheasants Forever said they would help us and bring the tools we'd need. There'd just be a few areas, just a little shy of an acre, that we would not be able to burn because of pine trees or the proximity to the road. So we would either have to till those up and replant them or do something to remove the thatch, because after 5 years, the flowers have a hard time getting their seeds into the ground to regerminate for the next year. So the tentative timeline, we're probably not going to hit that first April 15th planting time. That would be the best. But that's the earliest we could plant. The latest would be June 15th. So we'd really like to hit it by May 1st. So then on the right side is the picture of our church. Here is M66. This is our driveway. Here's our parking lot. Here's the shed. This is what I proposed, all these line pieces of what we would have as wildflowers. And then we would have to probably leave a buffer by the road, I'm assuming. And then these would be the areas in the front of our yard and the back of the yard. And then debate arose at the board meeting of this section right here that's in the front. There were some individuals that felt having the prairie grasses in the front would make it look unmanicured, and people would be very upset thinking we're making our church look like it is closed down and we're just letting stuff grow up. So we talked a little bit about what Plum Lake looks like and the beauty that it would bring in the summer, but there is the problem in the winter and the fall that there would be these little bit longer grasses than are normally thought of. It was brought up that you can mow this stuff down once the flowers are done, and you would still be okay. But in talking through that, we kind of decided that maybe it would be best just to remove this part, but that adds more mowing. So then we talked a little bit time as a board of, do we have to, or do we have a mowing company then come in to be able to mow this each time? What's that going to cost us? So the trustees said, we don't know how this will work out yet, but we'll take that on. That'll be a trustee problem. So we're probably looking at, from this point, the back is probably right. In the front, we will not have the prairie grasses in the front for now. And then in the future, it might be something that if people see how it looks and like, oh, that wouldn't be very bad to be in the front, maybe we would add it into the future there. The board also decided that, or I shouldn't say decided, it was discussed that if the funds don't come in, that we would just let our grass grow up. And it would just be tall bluegrass that is growing there now. And we just wouldn't mow these sections. We would still mow the area around our building, but everything else would just be tall grass the way that it is now. So that is the discussion that we had on the prairie grass planting. So we need to get that up and going. Obviously, deadlines are coming. We discussed that we don't want to spend the money until it comes in, just to make sure our congregation is for this. So in the next few weeks, I'll be, well, not in the next few weeks, I'll be getting with Anna. And then in the next few weeks, they're hoping that we can get a pamphlet created that can explain this of what we're doing to our congregation. And the board would also like us to see, to reach out to the community as well, to let them know what we're doing. And I said that I would try to connect personally with our one neighbor that's super close. They have like a garden area that makes a good buffer between us and them, but make sure they're okay with what we're doing and make sure we wouldn't create no hard feelings with what we would be doing with that. So that's where we're going with the native prairie grass plantings, what we're looking forward to doing there. And then the last thing that we talked about is, and I just closed my OneNote, so now I got to find my other thing, is the building roof fund. So we had $126,000 estimate onto our roof of what it would take to redo it. Insurance covered the vast majority of it, but they depreciated our roof for how long the shingles had been there. So that means we have to pay a little out of pocket. So after you take the insurance claim out of that, that still leaves the church paying $53,000 is our portion of the roof. And so we're going to use reserve funds to pay for that. But the board discussed about still asking members to see if some of them would be willing to donate above their normal tithe in order to help offset some of that cost of the roof. And so we would have about a 3-week campaign where we asked people for basically kind of, I took it as pledges that they would be committing to for a year from basically June to June. And we'd have those in, and then just whatever that offsets of that cost would offset. And we probably just reevaluate that idea if we don't get any donations for the prairie grasses. We figure if we don't get it for the prairie grasses, we probably won't get it for the roof. So that's what we're looking at for the building fund. And then other discussion, we just talked a little bit about Sunday evenings, about having a once a month time for people to get together to fellowship and to share like some kind of a meal together. And then they threw around the idea of maybe having a little devotional or something to that nature, maybe to it. So then there's some discussion with that of kind of what's the purpose? What are we looking to do with that? How does that affect the Sunday school class that is going on Sunday evenings currently? And then looked at like, what's the next step? Like, what are we hoping to produce through this? And basically the discussion went to what it sounds like is people are wanting a low barrier, no commitment thing to do. They don't want to do a small group because they feel like they're supposed to come every single time then, and they don't have that kind of commitment. Or once a month, maybe they could make it, or if they don't make it, it's no big deal. And then some discussion that came up with that is that a good idea as a church? Is that where people's hearts should be? Should it be well, we're going to create environments where you don't have to make connections with individuals. There is no commitment there. And so discussing that, is this a good low barrier for people who aren't ready to invest more into a small group, or are we creating an environment that's going to keep somebody from pursuing one of those because now they have an option where they don't have to have a commitment, but they can get maybe something that they're looking for. So we're still looking through that. So we decided, you know what, maybe as a board, we shouldn't be making this decision. And those who are thinking about maybe doing that will be having conversations with me, and both sides will be kind of thinking about it a little bit more to see, is this a good thing to do, or is there something to add to it to make it more beneficial, or is it good as it is, and having those discussions. So that was basically it. And then just we reminded ourselves that February 27th is congregational meeting, that Eric's asking people to turn in their questions ahead of time so he can research them, but he will bring them up at the meeting. And he does have some paperwork because finances is usually the thing people have the most questions about. That has the breakdown of every dime basically we spent, in case somebody wants to know what that finances are. And he said the problem that we've had in the past is people have asked questions that we can't answer on the spot, and we say, we'll get back to you with that. We get back to that individual, but what we found out is other people had that same question, and then they felt like they never got the answer to it. So that's why we're asking people to ask ahead of time, so that way we'll make sure that everybody gets the answer. And then our next board meeting will be March 15th. So that is the gist of what we went through at our board meeting, if you were interested.